So good morning and welcome to this in-conversation session on India. I'm not going to pretend to give an adequate introduction to the subject of contemporary India. So instead, I'm going to introduce the speakers. On my left is Salya Tripathi, who's a journalist and author of Offence, the Hindu Case. On my right is Professor Deepak Lal, James S. Coleman, Professor of International Development Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, and author of In Praise of Empires and the Hindu Equilibrium, as well as many other publications. Finally, Dr. Manali Desai, who's a lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge and the author of State Formation and Radical Democracy in India, 1860 to 1990. Now, I thought to launch us into the discussion, we'll get straight onto the subject of politics. The general election in India next year, the new hot brand name in Indian politics is Narendra Modi, the Prime Ministerial candidate for the BJP. To his fans, he's a breath of fresh air who'll clean up corruption and kickstart the Indian economy. To his detractors, he's a quasi-fascist who, in the words of Shashi Tharoor, represents a different model of India than the secular one that's been since independence. So let me just start by taking a few views. Salya, can I start with you? What's your take on Narendra Modi?
Very bad news for India, and very bad news for minorities, very bad news for the original idea of India, for a range of reasons. I mean, first, the negative, the costs of his leadership would be that it would basically mean India would give an imprimatur to the idea that there is impunity for if something horrible has happened in the human rights context, then the violator or the abuser, or if neither of that, then at least one under whose watch horrible thing that happened is actually aspiring for the highest office of the country.
So you're referring to the 2002
I'm indeed
riots.
referring to the 2002 riots and the way the court process and the trials have followed since then. When it comes to his economic benefits, which of course are touted hugely and which we can discuss more in greater detail later, what he has done is he has put the cream on a very good cake. He has put the icing on something that was inherently good. I grew up in Bombay. I used to go to Gujarat as a kid in the 60s and 70s. And if you moved from, once you cross, if you blindfold yourself, and you knew when the border changed between the two states, Maharashtra and Gujarat, the roads were so much better then, and I'm talking about 60s. Industries, whether it's petrochemicals, whether it is refineries, whether it is any sector of economy that you would see as critical, had always been there. Milk revolution that Modi has been taking a lot of credit for goes back to the 60s and 70s to Anand under a man called Verghese Kurian. So he's very good at appropriating credit of work done by others and claiming that it is all his doing. And full marks to him for being an excellent, very good at public relations. That said, he has, of course, built ports, and of course, he has maintained the infrastructure very well, which has not deteriorated. So I'm not saying that he's a bad administrator, but in managing riots, he was a very poor administrator.
Okay, thanks. Deepak, can I ask you, do you think Modi deserves credit for the Gujarat model of development? Is there anything to it?
Well, look, the point about India is at the moment it's a complete mess. They've really destroyed what was the first rate, legacy. And that legacy actually goes back to Vajpayee and the BJP. So the first UPA government really lived off the fruits of that. And then they're friends of mine. I mean, all the people running the country, Manmohan is a very old friend of mine, and they've just kept the eye off the ball. And the trouble is that there's been a divided party where Sonia Gandhi, she really wants to convert India into an Italian social democracy, which is crazy. So, and effectively, she's had the power, and my poor friend Manmohan has had to bear the responsibility. And, he's really hamstrung. So there has to be a change. Now, the good story is that Rahul, after sort of being this Hamlet-like character wandering around, to be or not to be, etc., has finally bitten the bullet, if you like, that he is now, when they were trying to pass his ridiculous ordinance and convert it into saying that, trying to overcome the Supreme Court's injunction that anyone convicted of any crime should not be in the Lok Sabha, so he said this is ridiculous, so he's forced them to change that. Now that's a game changer in some way. But he's up against Modi. Now the thing about Modi is, He's extremely articulate. It's true that he had a good legacy and he built on it. The only trouble with him, and no one really knows the answer to this, is he a fascist or is he not? I don't know. And all this thing about Godrej, etc. I mean, one can keep playing these blame games. I mean, the Congress, after all, this chap's father, Rahul's father, was a person responsible for the Sikh riots. And he, in fact, when people came and said, he said, things happen, or what do you expect? Anger. So, there's nothing to choose between the parties on that ground, it seems to me. And anyone who becomes the PM candidate has to somehow or the other not have a purely sectarian stand. You can't run the country that way, because it has to be a coalition, and you won't be able to do it. And Modi, one can see, is already being very smart. He's now taken over this slogan, toilets, not temples. There we go. So he's already moderating his thing. He's now doing deals, trying to do deals with various people. And I'd be very surprised if he doesn't somehow or the other have an image where in some sense this goes. And the thing is, he's extremely popular with the young. He's the only politician I've heard in India who at least, I don't know whether he succeeds in doing it, conveys a cogent, rational economic message, which is what India needs at the moment. So, it's open.
Okay, thanks. Manley, what's your pick?
I mean, I think we should just consider this moment at which, the founding of India was based on two parallel but really opposite tracks. And one was the partition violence. And we shouldn't forget that really modern India also has underpinning that this kind of really incredibly violent event. Now, if we vote in Modi as Prime Minister, effectively we're saying we haven't really dealt with that violent event. We haven't really dealt with the legacy of that. We haven't dealt with the mass rape, the carnage that occurred at the time. And what we're willing to do is to say, well, it was 10 years ago, 12 years ago, it's over. And I think that's really another very important factor, one really important factor we need to think about. So I don't think it's really just about Congress versus BJP. It's also about this idea of India and what kind of, idea we want for the future. Second, about the problems of the Indian economy, I mean, I don't think it's really about taking India towards Italian social democracy. I mean, we have to really deal with the incredible levels of corruption that are plaguing every social program, every welfare policy, and the state office itself, which has just become a sort of a license to pillage. So I think that problem of corruption, of impunity, again, is a cross-party issue. Neither Congress nor BJP have effectively dealt with this problem. So I think that when we vote in, if we were to vote in Modi, I'm not convinced that we should really be putting that kind of onus on a single leader as sort of the savior of the nation. I mean, I think that as a mature democracy, as mature voters, we need to think a little bit about what kind of social change we want to bring into, we want to bring about. And I think that has to do with issues of accountability, it has to do with issues of deliberative democracy, it has to do with what voters and citizens actually demand from their politicians. And I don't really think that, Modi is the answer. So I think I've made my views on him fairly clear.
You talked about the legacy of violence, both in terms of the Gujarat riots and going right back to partition. What about more recently? There were riots last month or a month before in Muzaffarnagar in Uttar Pradesh, which wasn't really to do with BJP, but local parties, and none of the parties really came out of it well. It seemed that everyone was involved one way or another. So is that an aberration, or is it a worrying sign that there is still going to be violence between Hindus and Muslims? Should we expect more in the future?
It's not an aberration. I mean, I think although we focus so much on 2002, there are periodic riots in India between Hindus and Muslims. And all the social science research, the in-depth work that people have done shows that parties are involved. And the BJP and its affiliate organizations, the RSS and VHP and Bajrang Dal, are absolutely implicated in this violence. And I think we should not let that pass. So, I mean, yes, it's true that, riots are endemic, but I think we need to understand they are politically manufactured in a lot of instances. And I think that is, a fact of life, in a sense, of political life in India, but I also think that that has something to do with the way that the parties are actually have extended themselves into civil society, and the reasons, riots are often invoked for, to win votes. I mean, that's one of the reasons why 2002 is actually said to have been manufactured in Gujarat. So, yes, I mean, I think it's an issue.
Is sectarian violence endemic?
Look, it goes back. When I was a member of the Foreign Service, one of the things you've got to do is go and spend some time running a little district. I was somewhere in Mysore, I've forgotten it, Dharwad. And one of the things you learn is that there are certain triggers for Hindu-Muslim violence. Every district commissioner and policeman had a manual written during the time of the Raj how to deal with this. I mean, going back to Casablanca, the days when this happened, you round up the Raj, put them in preventive detention or something, and lock them up. Okay, but still, it's never ever sufficient. Things can trigger things. So riots, the Hindu-Muslim riots have been endemic in India for at least 200 years. Now, is it getting worse? I'm not sure it is, quite honestly. And the thing is that now this has become a way for democratic politicians to use this to go on a vote, create sympathy and various other things. I can give you many instances where this, in fact, we've seen this with our own eyes. So I don't take that as something terribly serious. As I said, this Blot and Modi's thing about Godhra, but it's just as much in the other parties. So I wouldn't take that. The main question now is, how do these two parties, because it'll have to be a coalition, either the Congress-led one or the BJP-led one, who are they going to get as associates? And I wouldn't take anyone's current position seriously. It's all going to be a bargaining game. It depends ultimately upon how many seats they get. So the first round, which will be fought, will depend very much on, now it's going to be quasi-presidential, Rahul versus Narendra Modi. And, the jury is out on that.
Okay.
Because I think if you asked me this about a month ago, I said Rahul is no chance, but I think he's now shown his mettle to some extent, so it's over.
Okay, Salil, do you agree? Do you think that in coalition building, communalism plays a role?
Yes, it will, and in a sense, I'm not very sanguine about Modi's chances precisely because coalition building requires an element of compromise. When you speak to people who deal regularly with Gujarat bureaucracy and Gujarat governance, they do say that it's his view that prevails. Now, on the issues that matter to them, it happens to be that they are on the same side, and it coincides because we are largely talking about business people. But he's not known to be a man who can compromise. In fact, his leadership has led to people leaving the party from the BJP itself. So he will find it hard. I'm also not entirely sure that the Congress candidate for Prime Ministership will be Rahul Gandhi necessarily so. I mean, Congress seems to be, and I could be wrong, I'm not an academic, but it seems to me that Congress is moving toward the corporate model of governance, that there's a ruling party with a ruling family which has the equity interest in the party, and a management is brought in to run the company, but with a very strong, intrusive chairman of the board or chair of the board, who happens to be someone from the Gandhi family. But the Prime Minister is either someone like Manmohan Singh, or it could be Meera Kumar, or it could be Jairam Ramesh, or it could be Nandan Nilekani. Any of these candidates could be potential Prime Ministers. So I'm not entirely sure that it would be Rahul Gandhi. Just going back to your question about UP riots, I mean, I'm not at all imputing an allegation here or anything of that sort, but it has to be said that BJP now has nominated a politician called Amit Shah to manage its politics in Uttar Pradesh. Now, Amit Shah, for those who are passionate about Indian politics would know, was a minister in Narendra Modi's cabinet and was implicated in violence. He was also charge sheeted. Right now he's out on bail, and he's now put in charge of the most populous and probably the most communally sensitive state. He did make a long visit there. He did talk about building a temple, and soon after that there was violence. Now, I'm not saying that therefore 1 + 1 + 1 = 3 or 33 or anything like that, but it does show that there is some game plan afoot within the party, which is worth keeping an eye on, at least.
There's one different issue, moving away from politics, we can come back to that I think we should address, which is the position of women in Indian society, which has obviously been highlighted by the notorious Delhi rape case of last year, and which provoked an outpouring of protest. The death penalty given to the perpetrators. But there's a sense that this has revealed a deeper problem in Indian society that's been neglected and that needs to be talked about. So Manli, what's your take on that?
Well, yes, I mean, I agree. I think this is an endemic problem. I don't know where to start even, because in a way it's a continuum. You know, the violence against women is part of a continuum in which women are devalued, they are victimized. At the same time, you know, we have we're at a very interesting moment. I mean, women are becoming much, much more empowered economically, politically. There is a vibrant women's movement in different sectors of Indian society, and women are out on the streets more. They're more visible, they're taking charge of their lives, and I think at this particular moment, I think these two things are conflicting, expectations of women versus their assertion, and I think that is producing a lot of anxiety among men. But I think the problem, honestly, is mass sensitization programs. I mean, I think the men have to be really taught that, you know, certain kinds of behavior are completely unacceptable. And I mean, we are talking about the rape, and I'm glad the rape has brought this issue to the core, but I think if you read the Indian newspapers, you go and visit, you spend some time there, the level of kind of implicit symbolic violence that's directed against women is really incredible. I mean, workplace harassment is rife. More women are entering the workplace, but they're also subject to unimaginable forms of sexual harassment. I think you might recall the case of Kanda, the Haryana, I think he was the Chief Minister, I can't remember. I mean, this is an ongoing case. He absolutely harassed this woman to death. She actually committed suicide on the basis of this. Now, this kind of thing just goes by, you know, it's in the newspapers and then it's gone. And I think, you know, I think absolutely mass sensitization might be the only way to deal with this incredibly horrific issue.
Deepak?
There's a very serious problem. It's not just India, but also China. And the Chinese call this problem with their branches. In China, it's self-inflicted because of the one-child policy, so they've had, I mean, the sex imbalance now is absolutely horrendous. Similarly in India, but India is largely because of amniocentesis, you know, they've been murdering child babies, and it's a long history. And as a regional divide, north versus south, broadly thing. Now, the trouble with this is, once you've got excess males, there's a lot of evidence on this, goes back, anthropological or what have you, then you immediately start getting these phenomena. I mean, you get a lot of men who can't find brides. They also tend to be, in some ways, you know, they sink to the bottom. You get huge underclass. They're violent. They don't follow any social norms. There's ways in which some sort of social control is maintained over these males through the families. That disappears because they're very often, you know, floating around as migrants. And you see this phenomenon. I mean, all these rape cases, you look, there were migrants who come in, they were, you know, lower middle class, not even that. I mean, they were literally working class kids, people who had no future. And, you know, so this is an endemic problem which is going to get worse, in my view, just given the demography. Now, it's true that attitudes are going to change, they have to change, but that still doesn't mean that you will not get this aggressive behavior, just given this bare branch phenomenon. And it's going to be much worse for China. Why? Because at least in India now, you've got what you might call it, inter-regional brides moving. I mean, the Keralese brides moving to Haryana, etc., which would not have imagined. No Haryani mother-in-law would have accepted it, but now they have to. China, it's very difficult because in China they still have this racially exclusiveness. They don't really want, I mean, all the surplus. But though there's a tremendous amount of trafficking taking place. So what is the consequence? I think a big consequence, which is much, much more serious when you think about it, is that what are the other ways societies have coped with bad branches? Okay, in India in the mid-19th century, they had all these bands, because the sex imbalance was there in the north, and they were created into roving bandits. And the Thuggis, for instance, this is all part of the same phenomenon. So the most common way for states to deal with this, you know, either you have internal armies which then try and root, rape, murder, or you start wars. Now, you've got the two largest emerging economies in the world, huge populations with huge bare branches. They've got all sorts of problems with them. So what the most likely outcome, in my view, is, I hope it doesn't happen as long as I'm alive, is that these two will put their branches in the traditional way, arm them, and fight a war where they'll kill each other.
Okay, that's quite a prospect. Salil?
I won't go into speculating about an India-China war or anything of that sort, but I did want to pick up on a couple of points. I agree with a lot that was said about the situation of women. And I do think that it's not the failure of laws alone, because there are enough laws. Amniocentesis, to which Deepak refers to, was something that was outlawed in many states in the 1980s. And yet it goes on. I mean, you go to any hospital in India and there's a poster saying that it's a crime to ask for the sex of the unborn child. And yet people find out, and yet you have this, this very genuine problem. And I think, and this is where you have to think of someone with a Gandhi-like influence, because this requires a societal transformation. Because the change has to come in the families, because if daughters are devalued, mothers are complicit in it. Daughters-in-law are treated badly, mothers-in-law are complicit in it. So it applies to both men and women. Families have to look at it again. Schools have to look at their curriculums again, and in exactly what kind of stereotypical images are being repeated, and so on. And also the temples, mosques, and churches of India, they have to look again at it. And it does go, I mean, the example of Delhi case we always cite, because it looks like a typical case of upwardly mobile young woman studying, wanting to become a therapist, physiotherapist, and these, the phrase that New York Times has used in the story which appeared today, the feral men of India who are just walking around, migrants looking for it. But if you do a class analysis or caste analysis, or if you try to break down the figures from the National Crime Register of India, you will find that it's a problem everywhere, even in upper classes, even in lower classes, even in this caste or that caste, this religion. So it's a national crisis and a national problem, and it has to be addressed at that level. And obviously, if you're talking about a kind of approach that a Gandhi would be needed to fix it, you're talking about a couple of generations at least.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to come to the audience.
I worked in Delhi during the 1996 election. It was fun listening to all the polling stations being blown up. Nothing seems to have changed. In fact, from what I hear today, nothing has changed. Feral men wandering around, not working. Is there any land laws to stop people encroaching? Did you ever finish Delhi Power Station because the land was disappearing before you stopped? There's a minimum age of 18 for marriage. Is it enforced? And best of all, one part of infrastructure I'm interested in, not just sort of women's rights, but if 95% of the marriages are arranged, please correct me if I am wrong anywhere, some of the mothers are putting their feet down. They want better lives for their daughters. They're telling these young men, no toilet, no bride. Are they succeeding yet?
No, my question is really about the increasing fragmentation of the political system in India. Because over the last few elections, we've seen the rise of regional parties. I mean, I think the latest polls, I don't know how reliable the polls are. The one I saw was Congress, basically its number of seats halved roughly to 102. But BJP was about 146. It wasn't, I mean, coalition, as you said, is the order of the day. And really, the implications of that for the economic future of India, I think there's a general consensus that, I mean, Manmohan Singh as finance minister was regarded as a great reformer, and so there were very high expectations of him when he became prime minister. But obviously he's been stymied by coalition in bringing in those necessary labour reforms and structural reforms within India, the necessary economic reforms. I mean, Namo may have the support of Ratan Tata and Mukesh Ambani. If not their endorsement, at least they've made clear they're not opposed to him, and so they have hopes of him. But with this system and the increasing fragmentation, I mean, economic reform is really not very much on the menu.
Can I answer that?
Yeah, I'll just take one more and then I'll come back.
I don't know much about India, actually. I'm from Germany, but I was a little bit shocked when you mentioned that when you enter an Indian hospital, there are posters saying that it's a crime to ask about the sex of your baby, because it seems to me that for us in Germany, it's the first thing pregnant women do, and it seems to be very natural. It was the first thing I did when I was pregnant and had my child. I wanted to know the sex of my baby, and it seems to assume that every Indian woman who does ask about the sex of her baby wants to do this for very, negative, backward reasons. And it links into the kind of image which we get. In Germany, we get very little news about India, but the rape case was on the front pages of all newspapers. And you have this impression that all Indian men must be rapists. You get this kind of very backward image of a country, which is one of the largest and probably most interesting countries we have in the world today. And what you said, the kind of mass sensitization program which is needed would actually link into that image a little bit, saying, you know, that Indian men seem to have a very real problem. And surely that can't be true. It can't be true that somebody who mobs a woman at work would commit the same kind of feral crime somebody committed. The young men obviously committed who killed the young lady who raped the young lady in the taxi. Yeah. So it seems to me that we need to get the balance a little bit right here when we're having this discussion.
Okay. Can I to start this off? Economic fragmentation is the best hope for India. If you look at the performance of states, the real story of India is how the worst performing states are now actually delivering. Take Bihar, Chhattisgarh, all these. So the Gujarat story is there, but he's right. Gujarat was always a high performing state. The real story of India is the real basket cases in the north. And here the story is that a factor shows you the strength of democratic politics. These states are ones where the existing chief ministers have won 3 elections. And so the message has gone out that you had to perform all these basic goods which, you know, previously, and caste doesn't matter, nothing matters. Performance matters. And that's a very, very important signal. And that is now passing through, not just that, all states. It hasn't hit the center yet because people are putting these things together. But I personally believe the best thing for India is to break it up into even more smaller states. It's too big. It's gigantic. It will be broken up again into two or three more states. Telangana, I think there's no harm having Telangana. I think it's perfectly fine. I know they started, but this is purely a political reason and agitation. But it's absolutely sound. I mean, the smaller the state, the closer the politicians are to the electorate, and they get the message quicker, and they know they will not get re-elected. So that is a very, very good sign, and that is really the hope of Indian democracy. Now, one of the reasons I support Modi to some extent is that unlike Rahul, who's going around sort of sleeping in Dalit homes, etc., I mean, you know, he's still discovering India, if you like. Modi, people don't remember this, he is from an untouchable class, which is the lowest of the low. Now, he hasn't played this card.
He's an OBC, he's not untouchable.
Okay, OBC, OBCs.
I mean, I don't like these categories either.
Fine distinctions, yes, but I mean, essentially, he hasn't played this yet, but this chap, he's now sent off to Uttar Pradesh, has started making these things, but they want to take away some of the votes from this untouchable leader, you know, Mayawati. They want to take that away. At the same time, he can't actually give up the Hindutva card, because that is partly what he wants to get the other people, the other Samajwadi party. And you know, their performance has been lousy, he can play. So he's got a very sophisticated agenda. Now, what happens at the end of it if he gets power? As I said, I'm skeptical, I don't know. But given the dynamics of politics, that he has to stay in power, he has to put these different groups together. My guess is that he will not be divisive. I mean, even though this takes, I can't stay in power without that. And let's see what happens. But at the moment, all these fears about India breaking up, that is, in fact, it's not going to break up. But fragmentation is a good thing. And the success of India really depends upon that. And if you look, so don't look at the national performance one moment and say, look at these different states, and your picture will completely change.
I completely agree with Deepak on the fragmentation argument, because if you look back since 1984, India has not been ruled by a single party. All the governments since 1984 have been coalition governments. And that is the order of the day. We have a guest here from Germany, run by coalitions, largely. Western Europe, they are the order of the day. In a large, multi-everything society, you have to work together. And the idea of one leader, one nation is scary. And that's, in a way, some of Modi's supporters are building that argument that, you know, we are one people, one nation, one leader. And that's scary to me, at least. So that's one point I wanted to make. But to the question that you asked about these posters, they became necessary because there was a correlation between people. And I'm not blaming the mother to be here. It was often her husband, or often the in-laws, or even her own parents who would insist that the fetus be aborted. That was happening, and that was happening. I remember there's a statistic that was used in the 80s in India. I wrote a story about it, and the statistic is very gruesome. I've heard this repeatedly from many NGO activists, and there was no way to track back the original source. But even if it is untrue, it indicates the nature of the problem. That 7,999 of the out of 8,000 fetuses that were aborted during a particular period were of girl children.
Yeah.
At one particular time. I'm talking about 1988 when I used to work with India Today magazine, and I've written that story. So, and I did try very hard to go to the original source. I could not. I had to stop with something called the Foundation for Research in Medical Health, which had given me that statistic. So that is a problem, and it's not a problem only of the mother-to-be, but of the family, which is why I go back to my original point that the change has to be literally start at the family unit itself. And given that, does it, the other part of your question, whether are all Indian men potential rapists? I hope not. I mean, to start with, I'm a man from India, and so that I hope not. And I don't. But one thing I would say for a large country like India, I would quote Neeraj Chaudhary, who said that in India even exceptions run into millions. It's so large. So even if there are only 2% of Indian men are rapists, you're talking about 20 million people or something like that, which is a very large number, larger than European countries. So.
Okay, Manali?
Yes, I mean, I think I would really stand by this idea of continuum. Just because there's a continuum doesn't mean all Indian men are rapists. That's an extreme suggestion, and I would never make that. What I'm trying to say is that we really need to address and root out the attitudes that persist in various sites, not just in the specific case of a rape, but the fact that it's acceptable for there to be a culture at the workplace so that women are hounded and harassed and, phone calls all day long, stalked. There's enormous instances of stalking that go on. We have to confront it. I think we have to confront it in a mature way without thinking about what is our image in the world, and if we're so self-conscious, I think we'll keep sweeping the problem under the rug. So in my view, there is a need to consider this continuum without exceptionalizing and sensationalizing violence. I completely agree with that.
The way that the rape was covered in Germany, all over the West, there was a general tendency in the Western coverage to suggest this was a kind of throwback to backwards pre-modern India, where in fact there were, I've forgotten exactly who, there was a conservative commentator in India itself who had said this doesn't happen in Bharat, the ancient India. It happens in India, and suggesting its modernity. I mean, those are both extreme positions, but there does seem to be a problem of old India and the traditions, including marriage traditions and caste and so on, with modernity. Is that making things worse, or are we seeing a continuation?
Is there a tension between the kind of more traditional institutions and the modern? Well, yes, in a sense, I think so. I think that the kind of resurgence of interest in how panchayats are policing and young women, has to do with their sense that globalization, the temptations for women to adopt Western lifestyles, these are all seen as threatening to particular ways of living, caste tradition. So yes, I do think there is some kind of a clash going on here. But on the other hand, I think that the violence is also occurring in the modern spheres of society. So that I think somebody here mentioned that it is happening at all levels. It's not just the traditional old caste ways of doing things. I mean, these are middle-class, modern, young men, not just feral, unemployed men, by the way. I think this is, the instance I gave you of the Haryana minister, he was not the chief minister, I think he was Minister of Family Welfare, go figure. But I mean, these are men in power, these are educated men, who are also complicit in the violence. I think we need to have a discussion about these various spheres in which it's happening. But I agree, yes, I think there is some sense of threat that is, forcing some people to turn to more repressive ways of looking at what young girls are doing in public.
Okay, sadly we only have 10 minutes, so I'll take a few questions.
I'm a computer engineer. And India does a lot of software exports. Let's talk about some of the positive things. Some time back we heard about India earning a lot of money. Now, the per capita income is still low, and I think that's the basic problem. There isn't enough money to do anything. What happened to all the money that that came in from the software. They've got to go into a
Keep it from where?
black hole.
Software industry. yeah.
One is about education. I mean, there is no doubt that India supports a very high standard of education. Children in slums go to education. Family support children to go into education, and they get to, willy-nilly, get to, A-levels. But the problem is after A-levels, isn't it? I mean, the problem is after you finish your education, how do you go on, move on to a future career, a career-based profession? So you have to jump through various hurdles. You've got to know an important person, pay someone for a place, and all this sort of thing happening. So the question is, and I think there is a huge gap between the completion of education and harnessing of education towards something more significant. And my question is, which of the political parties support and want to streamline education?
Could I just return to the question of regionalism and the idea of fragmentation being good for India? Because it seems to, at some level, be counterintuitive, because there's a huge gap, obviously, between urban and rural communities. And I just wondered, in the context of the election, whether there are any national strategies for trying to overcome those inequalities. I mean, this is not a problem exclusive to India. I mean, China is facing a very, very similar problem. And I just wondered whether, in the context of the election, whether there's a discussion. I mean, federalism is one thing, but fragmentation is another thing, and can be very negative in terms of strengthening very backward ideas, nationalistic ideas, and religious divisions.
Just a question about whether this is a slightly downbeat take on India that we're hearing this morning. But at the same time, I went to India in 1990 and had a fantastic time. And then I didn't go back until 2008, at a time when there was a huge amount of excitement about India and how it was changing its prospects. And it seems to me, perhaps over the last year or so, perhaps with the growth rate declining, that excitement has declined a bit. And one thing that was spoken about a lot a few years ago that no one's mentioned is the demographic dividend. Yeah. And a huge excitement about India's young population. But then that leads me to ask you about education, because I've always been shocked at the number of young people in India who don't go to school. And it seems, I don't know what the figures are, but it seems to be an enormous number of young people don't go to school. And how will you get a demographic dividend if people aren't being educated? So I'd be very interested in your sort of take on both the prospects for India, whether we're being too downbeat, but also specifically on education.
Very quickly, on the software question, to answer your question, I think software exports are about 10 to 12% of India's total export profile. That's one reason why that wealth may not be visible. Secondly, most of them are private companies. So they declare dividends, they keep it to themselves, they buy companies abroad. Or like Narendra Modi and Azim Premji, they set up foundations to do good work, Infosys Foundation and Azim Premji Foundation, which is doing a lot of good work on the question about education that has come up, about looking at both primary and secondary level education. So, and the other problem is that it's how many engineers India produces a year and what is the need globally. If you really look at the numbers there in the industry, you will find in the end, you cannot burden the entire prosperity requirement of India on the shoulders of that one industry, precisely because it is at least in two tiers. One is the kind that you mentioned about Middlesex University, that people who are doing very basic business process outsourcing, which is with extremely low margins. And at the same time, you have companies like Infosys and TCS and so on, which are doing large turnkey projects and competing with the likes of Accenture and SAP and so on. So it's a diffuse field, and to try to get from that diffuse field an answer that it will respond to all the needs of India would not be right. What would be good, and this brings back the education question again, is what you see among the Dalits in India, a great desire to learn maths, science, and English language. In fact, in Bihar or Rajasthan, I'm not sure, there's a temple to a deity called English language. So the politicians want kids to learn only Hindi, but the kids want to learn English because they know that that's the way to get a good job Even if it's a very low-paid job, as someone to answer the phone call and tell the guy in room 4.02 to go and fix the doorknob.
Not at all downbeat about India's prospects. We started by discussing politics, and I told you there are two political stories. One is the states, one is the centre. And the great thing is the centre is becoming more and more irrelevant. Unfortunately, there are certain things which are under its control. For instance, labour laws, all these other things which they have to do something about. But I think as the pressure mounts, they're going to do something about it. They can't, and that's a great strength of democracy. You know, they're self-correcting mechanisms. We're seeing those operating. On this question of the demographic dividend, you know, the most important thing which India has to do is to get rid of these labour laws, which actually go back to the Raj. They were set up by the Raj to prevent India from competing with Lancashire. We've got those and we strengthen them. So in fact, if you employ more than 10 or 15 people now, small businessmen, you don't want to expand, because if you get that, you hit all this huge thing. And this strengthening was done by Indira Gandhi in 1981. And all you have to do is to go back to what the laws were, even in the Raj time. That'll give us enough time to take over all these things which China now is vacating. And that's a big gain. On education, the most important story which doesn't come out, my friend James Tooley has been doing a lot of research on this. In India, the poorest of the poor, so he's absolutely right, they all know the value of education. They know the value of English, math, science. The state schools are hopeless because essentially the teachers don't come. What they want to do is to get money from these parents for tutoring them outside, for classes which they should have actually done. And it's a complete disaster. It's a private place, poorest of poorest. Our servants send whatever their small money is, they put their children in a rickshaw and send them off to the local private school. And these private schools are mushrooming. Now the government is now trying to put all sorts of standards, etc. It was a terrible mistake. My friend Parth Shah he's got an NGO just trying to fight this. But the ultimate answer is the government just give vouchers. This is happening state by state. And that's going to catch on because there's a tremendous demand for this and people value this. So there again, India has been done as a centralized state. The old model that Soviet planning, you had this model here, Whitehall knows best. And that is now being turned around. Because India is an aspiring society. It doesn't believe this old-fashioned notion of equality, etc. It doesn't cut. I mean, I always give a very simple quip. It's basically, whether you're Hindu or Christian, they say, go back to its roots. They've all adopted the Hindu, I call it cosmology. Now, as a Hindu, if you go and tell him, because they believe in reincarnation, okay, that now some social democrat or someone's going to come and change the order of things. So a chap who's born a Brahmin, and expected all the rights and goodies from that, is suddenly said, terribly sorry, this lower caste person, we're going to take your goodies away and give it to him. They don't accept that. And that is why socialism, all this has failed in India. It's an aspiring society. If you want to look at a model, it's not Europe. It's much more closer to America in that way. And that is the great hope. And that is now brimming up from below, not from the top. Forget about the top. Just go and read stories you can about different states, and the worst of the states, and see what's happening there.
I don't think India is a negative story. I think it's up for grabs. There's quite a lot of political turmoil. However, let's bear one statistic in mind, that the majority of the Indian working population is employed in the informal sector, and I think that is alone enough to tell you that there is a massive problem of educated unemployment. Yes, you can go and you learn English and you can get a degree, but there are often no jobs. And I found this from my fieldwork in Gujarat. There are lots and lots of people have done a BCom, B this, BA that, no jobs. So I think one of the first issues is, what is the quality of jobs being created? Let's look deeper at the statistics. You know, employment and unemployment statistics alone don't tell you about the quality of employment that is being generated. Is education leading you to a good job in the private sector? I'm not sure whether the answer is correct. I think it's true in certain sectors, but not in a whole lot of other sectors. You know, I think that's something we really need to think about.
Thank you to the panelists, and thank you for your questions.